Let me welcome you all. I'm Professor David Britton of the Department of English Literature and Creative Writing at Swansea University. And a big welcome and hello to you all. It's good to have you with us. And what I should say, of course, is that this event is being recorded in both English and in Russian, in Wales and in Moscow. So greetings to everyone here in the UK and in Russia. It's lovely to have you with us for this session on crime fiction and legal truth. A special welcome to our friends and partners from the Maxim Gorky Institute of Literature and Creative Writing in Moscow. It's wonderful to have to be sharing this event with you. I should say that the event is part of the UK-Russia Creative Bridge Programme, organised by the Cultural and Education section of the British Embassy in Moscow with the support of the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, and in partnership, as I said, with the Maxim Gorky Institute. So first of all, I'm going to introduce our panelists. Elwen Edwards, Professor Elwen Edwards is Pro-Vice Chancellor and Executive Dean for the Faculty of Humanities and Social Sciences at Swansea University. She also holds the university's special portfolio for the Welsh language and culture. Elwen read law at Cambridge and she's enjoyed a very successful career as a barrister. For our Russian audience, I should explain that a barrister is a very senior lawyer who either defends or prosecutes in the courts. What can I say? She specializes in criminal law at both trial and appeal levels. And she's been involved in many serious, complex, sensitive and high-profile cases in the UK, including, for example, leading the prosecution team in the April Jones case, a very famous case here, and the defense team in the Glacian Mine case. Elwen has also been a commissioner on the Commission for Justice in Wales, and I like this, in 2018, she was in the top 10 on a list of the 100 most inspiring women in Wales. And so we benefit from that inspiration here in Swansea, where she joined us in 2015 as head of the College of Law and Criminology, which she has overseen the growth, which has been pretty remarkable in the last few years. Today, that college is called the Hillary Rodham Clinton School of Law, and it's recognized as being in the forefront of innovation and legal education and practice. So, Elwen Evans.
Thank you very much, David. I don't recognize myself, thank you.
Let me introduce Philip Gwynne Jones. Philip was born in Swansea, here in Swansea, and he now lives in Venice, where he is both a translator and a novelist. His first novel, The Venetian Game, which kicked off a whole series of novels featuring the central character Nathan Sutherland. That first novel took him straight into the Times top 5 bestseller lists and was the book of the month at Waterstones, the big booksellers. His most recent novel is called Venetian Gothic. That's out now. Philip's written for the Sunday Times newspaper for Big Issue. He's a frequent guest on BBC. And in his spare time, and I don't know where he finds this spare time, he's so prolific, but in his spare time, it says here that Philip enjoys cooking, art, classical music, and opera, which features in, for those of us who've read his books know that opera, as well as a very bad taste in prog rock from the 1970s, features in his life as well as his work. I very much want to hear this, but I haven't. He also sings with sings bass with an ensemble called Cantori Veneziani. So if he breaks into song, you'll understand. Philip's published by the prestigious publishers Little Brown under the Constable imprint. And our third panelist is Dr. Kat Hall. Kat is a translator and an editor. She's also honorary research associate in modern languages here at Swansea University, where she used to work as a lecturer for many years before finding the way out. She is the editor of Crime Fiction in German, a very significant book published in 2016, and she runs the Mrs Peabody Investigates crime blog, which has a huge following. She's currently translating Punishment by the German barrister turned crime writer. So there's a lesson for you, Elwen, barrister turned crime writer. The German lawyer, Ferdinand von Schirach. So Kat Hall, it's lovely to have you with us.
To be here.
Now I'm going to start by asking all of you to shed your professional clothes, which could be exciting for all of us, shed your professional clothes and become consumers of crime fiction for a moment. And I'm going to ask you what you like to read in crime fiction. All four of us here are passionate followers of crime fiction. So when in time off, what do you like to read? Elwen, what do you like to read?
It's fascinating what I like to read, because my professional life for many, many years in terms of practice has been prosecuting and defending largely in murder cases. And so, you know, day on day, the work is around the horriblest, most horrific behaviours that people can display. But of course, they're almost always untidy, unsatisfactory, unresolved. And so people have always said to me, why, as a criminal lawyer, do I love escaping into an alternate world of crime fiction? And I think it's because it's so often, because it is the escapist side of crime fiction I love. I do not like the raw, vicious, violent type of crime literature. But I think it's because one has often a tidy, satisfactory, resolved outcome at the end of a novel. You know, the people, the place, the purpose is something that has a landing that is good and fulfills the circle. And I think that if I take my passion for that escape route to somewhere that I love, which is Venice, and I'm not going to mention the other Venetian crime writer, I probably shouldn't. Having discovered that first, when I discovered that there was a Welshman also writing and situating his novels in Venice, it's been fantastic. So I went this afternoon and just dug up some of them I could easily find in the library. It's fab. And I love it. And thank you very much, Philip, for all the pleasure that you brought to me and many others.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you.
The same question for Kat. And I think, Kat, you're obviously, a side of your work is very analytical in terms of what crime fiction is. But the Peabody blog is an enthusiast site, isn't it? So what do you like yourself?
I am very eclectic in terms of my crime fiction taste. So I enjoy cozy crime, police procedurals, and then the darkest of noir. So some examples might be Henning Mankell's Swedish Wallander series, which a lot of people will be familiar with through the TV adaptations. There's a wonderful Australian crime writer called Jane Harper, who writes Australian outback crime. One example there, The Dry, absolutely fantastic. And then on the darker noir side of things, I very much like David Peace and his Red Riding trilogy. Or is it a trilogy or a quartet? It's a quartet, actually, which is set in the 70s and 80s against the backdrop of the Ripper murder case and is extremely dark. So I don't have an attachment to any one particular subgenre. I go all over the place.
We should say, I suppose, that you have a speciality in German crime.
I do.
And is it characterized by something something special? Is there something special and different that fulfills another part of your reading love?
I think there's a lot of variety in German crime fiction. We're yet waiting for a breakout German crime author, perhaps, to hit the English language market. But there are some wonderful writers out there like Simone Buchholz, who has a series called the Chastity Riley series set in Hamburg, which is a bit noirish, private investigator style. Those are out, there's 3 or 4 of those out with Arenda Books in translation by Rachel Ward. So I'd thoroughly recommend those. And then, of course, Ferdinand von Schirach, because I'm busy translating his work at the moment. So I've been doing a lot of reading of his novel and his short story collections. And The Collini Case is a very famous novel that came out in 2011 by him. And that is a courtroom drama. And I would have to say that I do have a weakness for a very well constructed courtroom drama as well.
And Philip, is your reading taste anything like your writing taste?
That's a good question. I think, like many of us, I probably started with crime fiction, probably with Sherlock Holmes, and then the classic golden age British period, Agatha Christie, Dorothy L. Sayers. I still think a lot of that stands up really, really well. I do love the American hard-boiled series, Hammett, Chandler in particular. I mean, I love cinema as well, and I suppose I'm always filtering Chandler through Humphrey Bogart or somebody like that, really. But I think the humor in them is wonderful. His dialogue is just razor sharp. I'm in awe of some of this, of what he can do with that. More recently, I'm not a massive fan of the darker side of the genre, which is strange because I do like horror cinema and Italian giallo cinema in particular, and some of that can be extremely gruesome. I don't know why I like that on the screen. I don't particularly care for it in a book so much. And Kat mentioned liking a good, well-constructed courtroom drama. I've been exploring Italian crime recently since I moved to Venice. I read a lot of Italian crime. There's one writer I do like, Gianrico Carofiglio, who he's a lawyer and also a member of the Italian Senate. But what I like about his books is that, I mean, a friend of mine once just said, well, yes, they're a kind of like a manual on Italian jurisprudence, but I do like the humor there. And I was halfway through one of his books and I thought, this isn't actually about the case. This is about a middle-aged man realizing that he's not young anymore and he's a bit disappointed with the way the world is going. And I do like the very, very dry humor in that. So yeah, I like a bit of humor in my crime, really.
Yeah, I think that does show, of course, in your own writing, Philip, but that your own novels are sometimes the crimes are pretty extreme, but you have central characters with relationships which are warm and funny, really. And so I'm going to, having done that once around our panelists, I'm going to now ask Philip to tell us, Philip, how on earth did you imagine your central character? Because your novels, like many crime novels, are dependent on the depiction of the central detective. And of course, your central character, Nathan Sutherland, is an accidental detective. He's not a professional at all. He's the British consul in Venice who keeps tripping over crimes almost, or they land in his lap, and he can't manage to avoid them somehow, can he? So where did he come from? Where did Nathan come from?
Where did he come from? Well, when I started writing The Venetian Game, and I was trying to think, well, what is my protagonist going to do? Is he going to be a Venetian? Is he going to be an Italian? I'd only been in Italy for a couple of years. I didn't think I could really write convincingly as an Italian. And the other thing is, of course, Elwen mentioned the other Venice-based crime writer who has written 30 novels about Commissario Brunetti. Donna Leon casts a mighty shadow. And if you write crime fiction set in Venice, and it's a police procedural, you are going to be compared to a writer who has had huge success with over 30 books. And that's a little intimidating if you're setting out on your first one. So I thought, what could he do? Could he be a private investigator? No, you couldn't be a private investigator in Venice. I mean, you'd be bankrupt within months because there'd be no crime to speak of. What could he do? And then I was teaching business English at the time. And one of my students was an Italian businessman who was also the honorary consul to Thailand. And wherever I turned up to take a lesson, he'd always be dealing with a problem. You know, somebody had lost their passport, or maybe they'd been in trouble with the police, or maybe somebody wasn't able to get home for some strange reason. And I thought, if my protagonist was the honorary British consul to Venice, which is a post that does exist, trouble would come to him. He wouldn't have to go looking for trouble, it would come to him. And he would have contacts in the police who could help him if I needed, you know, something which needed a policeman. He'd have contacts pretty much throughout Venetian society. He'd have contacts with the churches. And I thought, yes, that solves so many problems. And because he's British, I can write from the point of view of a foreigner. And so any mistakes he makes can be explained away as well. He's a foreigner, of course he makes mistakes. So that was the genesis of Nathan Sutherland.
And what about the genesis of his character? Philip, you and I have met and talked a few times now, and I can't help but think there is a fair amount of Philip Gwynne Jones in the in the nature of Nathan. Is that true? His interests are your interests, aren't they?
Exactly, his interests are my interests. And I did see Donna Leon speaking once, and she said that when she was writing Brunetti, she thought if she was going to spend 9 months a year in this person's head for however many years, he had to be somebody she liked. And I thought, if I'm going to spend 9 months in Nathan Sutherland's head, okay, his interests are going to be pretty much the same as mine. Okay, he likes old films, he likes old horror films, he enjoys cooking, he has impeccable taste in 1970s progressive music.
I have to cut in here, Philip, and explain for those who haven't read your books that not only does he have, in quotation marks, impeccable taste in prog rock and various other old horror films and so on. Mm-hmm. His partner does not share that taste, but she tolerates it.
Tolerates it. Federica, bless her, she's very good. Yes, yeah, it's like Nathan can be allowed maybe perhaps, 45 minutes of Jethro Tull, as long as it's followed by 45 minutes of Bach or Brahms, that sort of thing. And he does keep trying to say, well, watch this film, it's a masterpiece. And he'll just say, it's horrible, Yeah.
Which, of course, gives you enormous scope for the relationship part of your novels.
Yeah, a little bit of the
relationships.
Yeah, I like writing those parts, they're fun, yeah.
So, Elwen, having heard that depiction of how a character grows in a novelist's mind, you have to deal with real people who are not characters, even though they may sometimes think they are within a courtroom setting, because having been a court reporter, a journalist in my early days, I've sat there and watched performances, and they are quite often performances, aren't they? But
they are.
What would you say the crucial difference? And I'm picking up here on the fact that Kat similarly says she loves courtroom settings. The courtroom setting is wonderful, really, isn't it? Because it's in an enclosed setting with a beginning and an end. But what do you think are the major differences between, in this sense, between legal truth and crime fiction? We'll talk about it at a deeper sense in a moment, but just in how it plays out, what the realities are.
Legal truth is often very unclear, unresolved. It's very grey. I think when one has that experience depicted in a novel, and I am talking here about that sort of light, comfortable familiarity of the sort of characters that Philip so portrays, and they're great, aren't they? You know, the cat, the girlfriend, the best friend. You know, it's a lovely space to be in. The vicar, that's not his right title, but you know what I mean, the sort of people who populate that environment. And, you know, make no mistake, I love that environment where ultimately it's not necessarily the truth, but it's a resolution. The goodies win. And even if they don't, then the ending can be an unresolved one, because actually there are those ambiguities. But even within the ambiguity of resolution, there is a comfort. Now, obviously in a courtroom setting, as you'll know, David, from having been a reporter, and in the sorts of cases that one deals with, there's horribleness, there's anguish, there's angst, there's the question of whether even the most profoundly guilty will be found guilty. But I've always found that I've had to have things boxed. So I will watch a film. I can't watch horror. I just can't. I can't read it. I can't watch it. If I see Bambi, I'm always in tears, you know, when Bambi loses mother. But when I'm in a courtroom setting, because it's a totally different environment, you know, I will be dealing with the most horrendous, horrible violence, sexually motivated, torturous behaviors. And that doesn't, of course it impacts, but it doesn't have the emotional impact that reading something that is an environment of escapism has. So I think it's a fascinating dynamic, certainly from my point of view. And I think I find that world that I can escape to with Philip, with Donna Leon and others, although there is a particular magic in Venice because of the architecture, because of the environment, the music, the space, the people, you know, the Brazilian bar downstairs. All of those details give one a resolution and a satisfaction and an escape from a very hard, vicious world, which is really the world of crime and courtroom resolution and irresolution all too often.
I think this is a really interesting point to pass to Kat, because Kat, the book you've been translating touches on those questions in some depth, I think, doesn't it? So why don't you tell us a little bit about the book you've been translating and reflect a bit on what Elwen is saying, because I think it is a very crucial question.
Okay.
There's something about moral certainty or lack of certainty in it all, isn't there?
Absolutely. All right, so here is the book with it's a DIY cover, which I've just printed off just because I wanted you to see it. So the title in German is Strafe, which is punishment in English, and the author is Ferdinand von Schirach, who for many years was a barrister in Germany. And it's a collection of short stories, so it's 12 stories, 12 crimes, 12 perpetrators. And because of his background as a barrister, there's always the suggestion that these stories are rooted in his real life experience, that they're rooted in either cases that he himself was involved in or that he has known over the decades of his professional life. So that adds a little bit of spice, because as a reader, you never quite know, is this true? How true is it? The extent to which these stories are fictionalized isn't clear. And what I like about the way that von Schirach approaches the topic of the law and truth is precisely what Elwen doesn't like so much in her crime fiction, which is that he does thematize uncertainty and grey areas. And we tend to think of the law as a tool to reveal the truth about a crime or about the role of a perpetrator, and that's right and proper. But what he also shows is that the law has limits and that it can't always get to the truth. So one example would be a defendant who doesn't reveal crucial information to her defense lawyer. So her lawyer is unable to defend her properly in court, efficiently in court, because of that lack of information. And another point that he makes is that sometimes you have to sacrifice the truth in order to uphold the rule of law or to uphold laws in a constitutional state. So, for example, if evidence is found to have been obtained in an unconstitutional fashion, then it's not going to be able to be put before the court. And that might mean...
I know you've got a little extract there which actually illustrates just what you've been talking about. So why don't you read us that?
Right.
And then we're going to go to Philip for a little reading from Venetian Gothic as well. So let's hear that illustrative example.
So this is a short extract from Ferdinand von Schirach's short story Subotnik, from the Punishment collection and translated by me, coming out with John Murray Press. And what we have here is a courtroom setting, and the presiding judge, who's the lead judge in the German courtroom, is wrapping up her questioning of a key witness. And how have you come to be here in court? Through the Romanian police. Although I never told anyone about Berlin, word got around at home. A couple of weeks ago, 2 police officers arrived in my village and said that they wanted to speak to me. They said that the German authorities had asked them for help. A pimp who'd abducted girls from our area was on trial in Berlin. They showed me a photo of the defendant. It was him. Then I spent a while thinking about whether I should testify. In the end, I called the police officers. They organized everything, and I traveled to Berlin with one of them yesterday. And why did you decide to give evidence? Asked the presiding judge. Because of the other girls. There are still lots of these flats in the city. I don't know where they are, but that's what I heard a couple of times, and I'm sure it's true. The presiding judge thanked the witness for giving evidence. She knew what it must have cost her, she said. The witness shook her head. That's not something you can know. Neither the public prosecutor nor Seymour had any further questions. Thank you, you may step down now, said the judge. The young woman stood up and turned around. Seymour could see her scar, which threaded its way over the right-hand side of her face, from her forehead across her cheek and then down to her chin. She picked up her handbag and left the courtroom. The presiding judge asked the guard to fetch the defendant from his cell. She explained to him what the witness had said. It was only much later that everyone realized the mistake she had made. That's it.
And you need to tell us what the mistake was, of course, Kat.
Okay, so this is a procedural mistake which effectively threatens the defendant's position in relation to the Constitution. It breaches his constitutional rights. And as a result of that, the entire trial is put at risk. So I won't tell you what the outcome is, but it might completely collapse. It might be a retrial. It may be that the perpetrator walks free. But that procedural error is something that can't be put right effectively in that scenario. And so that's another example of where then the law effectively is letting down the victims and not able to get to the truth then.
Absolutely. And perhaps before we bounce to Philip, that's one for you to come back on, Elwen, because procedural errors are don't fit into our code of belief of the right result happening, I guess. And you need to unmute yourself, by the way. Yeah.
I do, and of course, there's a really interesting, and this isn't the purpose of today's discussion, but there is an interesting dichotomy between the German system and therefore the continental civil law system and the system that we have in Australia, where you were a reporter, where, in a sense, the impact of the procedural error is probably more mitigated and potentially excused within the British system than it might be in a civil law system. So there are some really significant differences there. And within the British system, it's sometimes referred to as the fruit of the poison tree. So you might get fruit from something that's poisoned in itself, but should it still be fruit that's used as evidence in the trial?
That's fascinating. And I know we've got quite a few law students here with us tonight, so maybe somebody might want to pick that up on the questions. I should have directed you. I see plenty of people are coming in on the Q&A function, but if you have questions, do please put them down there. We're going to leave time for questions at the end, and the questions are being monitored and will be put to the panel afterwards. But I'm keeping an eye on time. Philip, I think we'd all love, having talked about Nathan and so on, to hear a little bit from Venetian Gothic. But I suppose we should say you're going to read, first of all, a little piece that is a departure for you compared with the other novels. It's a little prologue that appears in the book in italics, so that we can see that it's not the primary story, but it is in fact the historic story which collides with the contemporary story at the end of the novel, isn't it? So
right, yeah. Venetian Gothic was my attempt at writing a modern Gothic mystery, in that it begins in a cemetery. There's a mysterious old dark palazzo and a family with a dark history. And as David was saying, the prologue is quite different to anything I'd really written before. There are no jokes in it. It's a little bit darker, this. So I'll read from the prologue, and then I'll read from chapter 1, in which we go back into Nathan's voice again. So if you're sitting comfortably, I'll begin. The dream is always the same. Mother and father are arguing. They say nothing to me, but I know it is my fault. Again. I am in the kitchen. I'm standing at the refrigerator, something in my hand. It may be a glass of milk, a fizzy drink. I don't remember, but I do know that I have lived this scene 100 times. They are shouting at each other, their words tripping over each other in their anger. Grown-up words that are too difficult for me to understand. My father swears and mother hisses at him, not in front of the boy. They stop hurling their spite at each other and turn to look at me. There is silence, just for a moment. I look back at them, standing in the hallway. I'm trying to be brave, to be a big boy, but all I want is for them to stop fighting. I want to run to them. I want Mother to hold me, to cuddle me. But there is something in her eyes that stops me. I start to cry. I try to hold them in, but the tears come slowly at first and then in great shaking sobs. Surely, I think, surely now they'll come. They'll stop fighting and they'll come to me and pick me up and hug me. And then there will be warm milk and more hugs and then bed. And everything will be all right and normal again. My father looks at me and then turns away. He looks at my mother and shakes his head. Give up, he says. I give up. He doesn't sound angry anymore, just tired. I never cried very much after that, for I had learned that it didn't do any good. Chapter 1. Sergio Cardazzo bowed his head and muttered a few words under his breath as he bent over Paolo Magri's grave. To his left, Lorenzo Bonzio, taller and thinner, leaned on his cane for support and reached out with his other hand to pat his friend on the shoulder. Sergio spoke again, audibly this time. Ciao, compagno. Then he bent to adjust the wreath in the shape of a hammer and sickle that was leaning against the headstone. I wondered if somewhere in Venice there was a left-wing florist that specialized in revolutionary funeral wreaths. If there were such a place, I thought, Sergio would be sure to know of it. The three of us stood in silence for a moment. I gazed at the inscription. Paolo Magri, journalist, 1950 to 2014. The wind was chilly and whipped at my coat as a fine rain blew across the cemetery. Again, Sergio's lips moved silently. Then he dabbed at his eyes, blew his nose, and clapped Lorenzo on the back. As much for his own comfort, I thought, as for his friends.
Thank you, Philip. And a real sense of the way that the construction of that novel, which goes from a boy's memories, which we can tell, we don't know anything more than that, into the real playing out of a mystery that begins in that cemetery. And again, for those who haven't read Philip's work, those that group of old left-wing Italians are some of his drinking mates and gambling mates, in fact. I have to tell everybody, I think, that a cat called Gramsci is just a masterstroke.
Gramsci is the most everybody's favorite character. I spend hours honing dialogue and people say, yeah, but what about the cat?
Okay, look, I can see we want to get in as many questions as we can, and I can see there's already loads of questions that have piled up. Dr. Elaine Canning from the Cultural Institute has been collecting and curating those questions. So Elaine, would you like to come in and steer some of those questions towards the panelists?
Yes, of course. Thank you, everybody, for a fascinating discussion. Lots and lots of questions coming through for you all. So I think we'll start with one for all three of you. And Elwen, you've already touched on this, but there's a question about the transferability of your preferences when it comes to crime. And the question is about the relationship between what you read and what you watch in terms of television series and films.
Sadly, I have to confess, it's bizarre really, because I am a passionate lover of literature in its broader sense as well. But there are those nights, aren't there, when you land in front of the television and think, I need that little bit of escapism. And the sad thing I was referring to earlier is that I actually enjoy exactly the same escape routes in terms of the lighter side of crime television series. You know, not too much blood, not too much gore, not too much reality, but a nice, tidy resolution at the end and interesting characters, although none as, I was going to say cuddly as Gramsci. I mean, Gramsci's all sorts of stuff, but he's certainly not cuddly.
He's not cuddly, no.
Absolutely not.
On that question, I think there's a very, Elwen and I were talking the other day about the fascination at the moment with true crime television dramatizations, which I have to say, as I said earlier, I was a journalist, and one of the reasons I moved from journalism to fiction was that I came to recognize that there's a difference between the facts and the truth. And you know, journalists work on the facts, but quite often can't get to the truth in the way that fiction can. And both Elwen and I share a sort of lack of interest, in a sense, in those true crime series, because if we want documentaries, we want documentaries. If we want drama, we want drama. But there is just at the moment, I'm just going to say this quickly, I don't know if anybody else has seen it, but there is an extraordinary Scandi experiment on television at the moment called The Investigation, which is about the woman who died after taking a submarine trip in a homemade submarine with a very strange person. This actually works at the pace of a true investigation and does nothing to, and is seen very much through the eyes of the police people who are trying to get to the truth, and the victims' relatives, actually. It's very interesting because I was watching it again last night and thinking it's done over 6 episodes, and it's very, very slow. And you have to get yourself into the rhythm of that very, very slow, which is completely different than the more normal disciplines of television drama. So I think it's an interesting experiment. I don't know whether it will be considered a success or not.
Can I just come back on that, because it is very, very interesting. Several cases I've been in have been the subject of, you know, television reconstructions, dramas, and so on. One recently, the Pembrokeshire Murders, was on 3 nights, I think. And yes, I recorded it, but I cannot bring myself to watch it, because you cannot reduce what was effectively, you know, one major investigation years and years and years ago, and then the double murder investigation. You cannot effectively reduce that into 3 one-hour slots or whatever it was. The subtlety and the detail and the nuance is lost. And I find that a very difficult ask. And every program, with the best will in the world, and you'll know this as a reporter, always comes with its own agenda. And very, very seldom is reality in a courtroom or in an investigation driven by an agenda in that way, or shouldn't be.
Sure.
Kat, what about you, Kat?
Yeah, well, I was just going to come back in. Your description of the investigation reminded me of a seminal crime series called The Killing, which some of you might remember, 2011, which was absolutely groundbreaking. It followed one family, one investigation. The daughter of the family is found dead in the woods, and it blew everybody away. It also happened to be the first subtitled drama that really broke through on BBC4 in the UK. And I remember watching the first 2 episodes and just thinking, this is this is so convincing that there's a kind of crossover really between drama and what one might think of as a kind of focus on a true case. The characterization of the family was absolutely wonderful, and I cried during the first episode, hard as nails, very rarely moved to tears. That is a series that, so I think what I'm trying to say is there's a sort of Scandinavian tradition of that very in-depth, slow drama. That
slow
really,
is the word, isn't it? Yeah.
The impact of a crime, the proper impact.
Elaine, next question. We could talk for ages.
Okay. We'll go to another question for all three of you. I think we'll start with you this time, Philip. Our audience are really interested in hearing a little bit as readers, but also in your case, Philip, as a writer, and Kat, in yours as a translator. Is your preference for crime novels which are set in the past, or novels which are set nowadays, which have a more contemporary setting? What's your preference as readers, as a writer, and as a translator, Philip?
Okay, as a writer, very, very much contemporary. I am in awe of people who can write good historical novels, because the research it must take must be extraordinary. My friend's Gregory Dowling, he does it. My friend Alice Hawkins does it. It must be so difficult, the amount of research. And I do a lot of research on my novels which are set in contemporary Venice. I can't imagine how much work there must be in researching a historical novel there. In terms of reading, I probably have a preference for the contemporary, but I do enjoy a well-crafted historical novel. Yes, yeah.
Mm-hmm. Well, one of the questions interconnected with that, I guess, in terms of place, one of our audience members is asking, why Venice and not Swansea? Why the Piazza San Marco and not Wine Street?
Oh.
Why Venice and not Swansea?
One day I will write the great Swansea crime novel with a murder on Wine Street, and probably instead of the Brazilian bar in the Venetian books, there'll be the no sign bar. Of course. Yes.
Now we'll hold you to that. We will hold you to that, Philip.
We will.
There are lots of very, very good Welsh writers writing contemporary Welsh crime fiction. If you want to find out about these writers, go to the Crime Cymru website, which is a wonderful repository of information on contemporary and historical Welsh crime writing.
I second that. Really wonderful resource.
Yeah.
So one of the questions, actually, one of the first questions that came in today was about Welsh crime fiction. And so, you know, this is a resource, obviously, is fantastic, and we can send that out to our audience afterwards. Mm-hmm. We can email out those details. But is there something in your view and what you've come across? Is there something distinctive about Welsh crime fiction that you can pinpoint?
My goodness me.
It's a tough question.
I'm the best person to answer that, given that I'm writing. I mean, I consider myself Welsh. It's where I grew up. It's where my roots are. I'm not writing something that's specifically Welsh, so I'm probably not the best person to ask on that. I think perhaps if there is, it's in the sense of place.
Sure.
Yeah, and that'll be it. And I think my novels, although not set in Wales, the sense of place is absolutely paramount. And I think in as much as we can characterize so many different strands of Welsh crime writing, I think it's that sense of place which is important.
Of course. What about you, Kat?
Well, they open a door to Welsh culture, of course, and possibly also the Welsh language. So, I mean, this is a relatively recent development that that Welsh crime writers have come together to form Crime Cymru, following the Scottish model, really. For example, there is a Scottish crime writing festival called Bloody Scotland, which has been set up by Val McDermid, Ian Rankin, you know, the Denise Minor, the big Scottish crime names. So I think there's absolutely room for the same in terms of Welsh crime.
Fantastic. And in terms of your, as a reader and as a translator, where do your preferences lie? If we go back to that question about crime fiction, which is set in, you know, contemporary times or in the past, where do your preferences lie?
I love both. As a translator, you have to dive into the text, and there's always lots of wonderful research that you need to do, like checking out gun manuals, for example, all sorts of things. I love historical crime fiction, so it would be a great pleasure to climb into a historical crime novel to translate it.
Great. And what about you, Elwen?
Oh, I enjoy the old escapist historical crime novels as well. You know, Ellis Peters and Cadfael and onwards. It's the same sort of, you know, it's people, it's place, it's purpose, it's resolution. So I think it's still that sort of, you know, circle that is a comfortable space if you want that escapist experience and resolution.
I think it's particularly comforting at the moment in the time that we're living through as well. We've come up with a term called respite crime. So crime fiction that's an escape, that might take you to a different place that you can't travel to, or that is comforting. I think we all need that right now.
Absolutely, absolutely. There's a really interesting question actually just has come in, which connects very nicely with that. And it's about crime fiction. And do you think crime fiction can be successful when it delves into social commentary? So, for example, Brexit, COVID, or do you think that takes away from that respite and that clean comfort?
I think there's absolutely room for it. There are already crime writers like Mick Herron who have engaged with Brexit, for example, in a very in a humorous, satirical way. So I think there's definitely room for that. Crime is a broad church. I think it very much depends on the reader's mood, the reader's preferences. The wonderful thing is that you can just say, what do I fancy today? Do I fancy some cozy crime, historical crime? Do I fancy some noir? What's it going to be? And there's going to be something for everybody there.
Sure, sure. Elwen, we've got a question specifically for you. So with your professional hat on, and you've talked to us about escapism and so on, but several of our audience members have asked about, how you feel when authors get legal aspects wrong, and how important is it to get the law right in what you're reading?
It's interesting, isn't it? And one can have conflicting attitudes. I quite enjoy a couple, well, one perhaps, of the sort of hospital sort of programs on telly. I've gone off it now, but I was very keen for a while. Some of my closest friends are doctors, and they just think it's appalling. How could I possibly waste my time watching that sort of thing? I think I feel the same about a lot of cases that are based in investigations and courtrooms, because when they do get it wrong, it can be spectacularly wrong. And that's quite, one feels quite offended. So I've got totally conflicting attitudes and answers to that. In a world that I'm not familiar with, I'm quite happy to go with it. In my world, I'm offended by it. So I think that probably says more about me than the genre of any fiction or program.
Yeah, it's really interesting though, because I think that also brings us into, the nuances of what a writer is doing with this material. So Philip, one of our audience members is asking about what is actually more difficult from your personal experience. What is more difficult to write, a crime novel or a short story, a crime-based short story? Which is more difficult, do you think, as a writer?
Oh my goodness me. I mean, I've written a couple of short stories for my regular readers on my website and the like. They weren't crime short stories. They were like little Christmas presents for the end of the year. I have put down a few ideas for short stories. At the moment, I'm finding it extremely difficult. I think there's a definite talent to doing a perfect little miniature of a short story, as opposed you've got this big old 400-page canvas to work on, and you can throw characters at it, and you've got space to explore, little things, art, music, whatever. You can go off on little tangents in that respect, supporting characters who were perhaps not totally necessary to the plot, but just push it in a little direction. It's yeah, it's a different discipline, and I find that quite difficult. Yeah.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. David, we have a question that's actually come in for you. When you were talking about the relationship between the facts and truth, and what do you mean by that? What do you mean by the relationship between facts and truth in relation to the genre?
Well, I think generally for anybody who is interested in delving into why things happen, there is a difference between the what happened, which is made up of the facts, and the why things happen, which is to do with the deep motivations of character and why we behave as we do, and sometimes why things don't happen. So I made that decision, I will say quite bluntly, I made that decision in Australia. I was appalled at a series of deaths in custody, and I was working on a newspaper, a big newspaper there, of Aboriginal people in custody. They were reported factually, it was true, the journalists did their job. It wasn't that was that they were being remiss, but actually it didn't get anywhere near the underlying truth. And so I wrote a play called Landlubbers, which was about that particular issue and what was underneath it all. And this had been bubbling up in me for a while, the fact that you can line up all the facts and yet you come to less than the truth. It's not that the facts contradict the truth, it's that they don't necessarily add up to the truth. So that's why I made the career change I made, and wrote a very a play which was effectively journalism on stage, and got away with it. But yeah, so I hope that answers that person's question. Yeah.
Lovely, thank you. I am conscious of time. I know we're just coming up to 5, but I do have one question. If we can keep it really short, I've got one question for each of you before we finish. So, Philip, one of our audience members would like to know, will COVID feature in a future Nathan story novel?
Right, well, I'm currently writing book 6, which will come out in 2022, and that book is set in 2019. So book 7, either I ignore it completely, or I make a reference to it, or I jump forward a few years, or I set the book in that blessed period in the middle of the year where things are relatively normal in Italy. It'll be one of those. I mean, what I don't want is for people to open page 1 and see, oh yeah, Sergio and Lorenzo, those guys, you know, we've all really liked over the last 5 books. Yeah, they didn't make it. I don't want to do that, you know. I'll find a way. Some way it's going to have to be confronted, but it can't be the focus of the whole book. That would just be
no, of course not.
Yeah.
Of course not. Elwen, one of our aerospace engineering students is with us today, called Marco. And Marco says that he is a real enthusiast of law as a subject. And so we've been talking about fiction today, but Marco's really interested in how he learns more about law and legal terms and so on. So what advice would you give to Marco?
Lots of advice. Won't take up time now. Why doesn't he get in touch? And we'll see what we can do to point him in the right direction.
Fantastic. We'll connect you. Brilliant. And Kat, final question for you from a translated perspective. Really interesting question, actually. When you're translating from one language to another, what principles do you follow in terms of translating legal terms, particularly where justice systems are very different in different countries? So how do you approach that?
Well, I do a lot of research, so I get some very dry legal tomes and guides, and I put together effectively a glossary. So I put together a term base of the German term and the English term. And the other thing I did with von Schirach, I was very lucky that other translators have come before me. So the Collini case was translated by Anthea Bell, the late, great Anthea Bell. And so I was able to go back to her translation and to look to see what terms she had used. And for the most part, I took the terms that she'd used, which provides a nice continuity then in terms of the translation of von Schirach's works. A couple of things, however, I did tweak, but she sort of blazed the trail for me, did a lot of the donkey work, for which I'm extremely grateful.
It's fascinating, isn't it? I think we could, we could talk so much more about this, and unfortunately, we are just about out of time. So, David, I'll hand back to you to wrap things up. Thank you so much, everybody.
Okay, thank you, Elaine. And thank you, panelists. What a great session. Needed to be twice as long, but it is what it is. And now for our audience, huge audience, marvelous. The first thing I have to say is, because we are living in 2021, can you please fill in the feedback questionnaire that you will get, because that helps us being able to do more of these things in the future. And then I need to give some thanks. First of all, panelists, I wish we could applaud you and you could hear the thunderous applause, but imagine it. We're all giving you a huge round of applause. So thank you, Philip, Kat, and Elwen. And thanks to Elaine for, as always, making these things possible and curating the questions so well. And then I have to thank the Cultural and Education section of the British Embassy in Moscow, the Foreign Commonwealth and Development Office, the Cultural Institute at Swansea University and Swansea University as a whole, and the Department of English Literature and Creative Writing. And then let's talk about our friends at the Maxim Gorky Institute of Literature and Creative Writing, the two Irinas, Yaroslava and Lydia in the embassy, who have been an absolute pleasure to work with, and we're very, very grateful for your support. So, and members of the audience, there are more of these things happening. We will be telling you all about them. Do join us again, and thank you for being with us today. And I'll say
thank you very much. Thank you, David. Thanks, Philip, Kat, and Elaine very much. Thank you.
Thank you.